if you can take your seat. We shall have now a presentation by the Coalition for Action, which is a new initiative of the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, that has decided to create a forum for putting together the perception that renewable have in the world today. It was started actually after the Wall Street Journal launched the so-called debunking the myth. And now we have the pleasure to have Kjaer, which is the sponsor, the senior director of the IRENA, to present shortly to us the first, let's say, public presentation on the Egyptian case. So we shall have about 10 minutes or more or less 15 minutes by Christian. Christian was kind enough to come from Abu Dhabi for this purpose. And thank you, Christian, for coming here and for addressing us on the Coalition for Action. I remind you that the Res for Med, as much as Enel Green Power, is a founding member. And we have Roberta in Abu Dhabi and Flavia here. So you have 10, 15 minutes, whatever. Ciao, grazie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vigotti. As was said, I work for the International Renewable Energy Agency. I've been there since 1st of February this year, so it's all rather new. And Mr. Vigotti, you forgot to tell me how to do this, but yeah. And of course, the International Renewable Energy Agency is a government institution. It's set up by 140 countries. It was established on the 8th of July, 2010. So it'll be 5 years in a few months. The Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency sends his personal greetings here, and he also asked me before I left to convey that IRENA and him personally are wants to be very, very closely involved in what is happening in Egypt. We would like to have some meetings, and the Director General himself will come out to Egypt sometime this year, probably in the autumn, and both in terms of policy development, we want to be involved, and the Director General will come out, as I said, very shortly. So that's about IRENA. I'm really here to speak about one of the most fundamental barriers to the deployment of renewable energy, which is myths. And as the presentation is called, Myths and Facts, this is really something that not only international institutions and governments, but also civil society and industry and organizations are spending an awful lot of time trying to dispel. There are a lot of concerns, and those concerns are a potential big barrier for the deployment of renewable energy. And some of these concerns are really genuine. There are visual effects, there are noise effects, there can be health effects and other effects from deploying renewable energy. And these are also many of the issues that are raised by people opposing a development in renewables. And there are legitimate concerns, but what we need to realize is that anything we do has concerns. And of course, there are also impacts from any other energy generation. So that's the first starting point, is to say, well, we have to say if we want energy, it has to be produced by some sort of technology, and they will have impact. And so the first thing to do is to actually compare what are the impacts and the credible concerns about renewables compared to if the energy had to be produced by something else. And this is where the Coalition for Action comes into the picture. It's basically, it was established in January 2014, and both Res for Med and Enel Green Power and also RECRE, which we heard earlier, were founding members of the coalition. And really what it tries to do is to identify common myths, collect data, either from research institutions, from governments themselves, or from the industry, that support what are the actual facts about renewables. Because the thing is that renewables are at a stage of development where the facts, if they're communicated as they are, actually makes renewables a very, very good case, and increasingly so. It's getting increasingly more cost competitive. It can be deployed in a larger scale than previously thought. So if the facts are presented in an objective way, there's a very, very, very good case for renewables, and that's what the coalition is trying to do. Of course, IRENA is working with the governments and for the governments, but the coalition is really trying to work together with industry, with academia, with NGOs, and trying to identify the facts about renewables in order to promote them and to overcome the myths. Just to give you one example, I've been in renewables for 17 years, and I think it was about 15 years ago, I was called by a journalist who had received a call from a scientist who had spent about a month calculating that if you put up wind turbines, because they took energy out of the air, it would actually slow down the rotational speed of the Earth. And he sent me the whole calculations of this and asked me if I had any comment on this. And I sent this to a physicist I knew at Copenhagen University, and he said, well, theoretically, this is absolutely true. You put up enough wind turbines, you'll slow down the rotational speed of the Earth. Of course, it will have no practical effect on anybody, but it is true. And this was basically something that was put forward as a myth. And of course, the response to that, we found out the best response would be, well, if the rotational speed goes down, it means that people get younger. So rather than the headline being, it slows down the rotational speed of the Earth, it became wind turbines make you younger. But it's one of those things that a lot of people spend a lot of time calculating these things, and it takes up a lot of space in people's minds, and it's actually for no reason, because the conclusion doesn't matter for anybody. And that's what the coalition tries to do. Remove that myth from people's brains and fill it with facts, and that will really, hopefully, mean that we can spend our time more reasonably and presenting the facts. These are the coalition members. There are about 46 members of the coalition. It's open to anybody, so anyone who would like to join IRENA's Coalition for Action are more than welcome to. Now, what we did back in 2013 was we sent out some questionnaires to, I think, about 300 different organizations, asking them what kind of myths are you actually mostly confronted with every day. And we got, I think, 400 or 500 different myths that could all be grouped into these 10 most common myths about renewable energy. That's basically more or less the gist of everything that is said against renewables. What we then did was, for this meeting about Egypt, you've heard the Director General of RECREEP speak before. We worked with his people from his office, very, very good group of people, and they went out and started looking at what are the actual myths, what are the most common myths that are being presented in Egypt today. And they looked at newspapers, they talked to people in the street as well, and they actually came out with these 4 myths that were the most common ones that they could find in Egypt these days. And it's basically the usual ones. They're too expensive. Intermittent, unreliable basically means it doesn't work. Other resources are much more appropriate in providing energy, and they are really immature or small scale. These were the 4 myths generally. And what they also looked at was they found some articles in newspapers to support this. So myth number 1, renewable energy is expensive. We had a quote in a newspaper that said the cost of solar energy does not fit our economy from a financial point of view, basically that this is too expensive. And that really goes against a lot of things that are happening at the moment, and we've seen references to cost. Paulo Frankel showed some cost references, and what we see on this graph is that many renewables, even at gas at $3 per MMBTU, you actually have onshore wind and hydro competitive in some areas of the world, and even with a higher gas price, which is more relevant in other parts of the world, a lot of renewable energy technologies get into the band where they can compete with renewables, and that is really the fact, and that goes for onshore wind in many places, and also for PV solar, and so certainly in distributed generation, PV solar and off-grid solar is very, very cost competitive compared to, for instance, diesel or imported. And this is, of course, the reason for that is that the cost of solar panels have decreased dramatically. There was a reference earlier also to the fact that in the United Arab Emirates, where I live every day, there was a tender in Dubai for less than 6 cents, US cents per kilowatt hour for a PV project, which is quite impressive. The other myth that Recruit found on the streets of Egypt is that we cannot rely on it on a permanent basis. Solar energy is intermittent, and the presence of fossil fuel power plant is important. And that's actually true. But it's one of those things that when people start talking about we must build some renewables, they take one technology and say, well, you can't power your entire system 100% with this technology. And you actually have never said that. You've just said, well, we're going to increase our amount of renewables in Egypt. The target is 20% in 2020. That can certainly be done. And certainly in Egypt, which has a very large part of their electricity currently coming from gas. And gas and wind and solar complement each other very well because gas is very flexible, together with hydropower, of course. So I think the challenge here is that the fundamentals for Egypt are correct. Gas is a very flexible technology, and it can complement both solar and wind and also other renewables quite well. One of the myths, and that's what this graph is showing, is that it's intermittent and it's unreliable, basically. And what you have here is the integration cost of onshore wind power, and you add that, and this graph compares it then to nuclear energy, the Hinkley Point, or gas power plant with CCS, or coal power plant with CCS. What is interesting from this perspective is also that I've never seen any calculations on the integration costs of non-renewables. There are thousands, maybe not thousands, but at least hundreds of studies on the integration cost of renewables, especially wind. And definitely, the integration cost of wind energy, because it's variable, are higher than many other technologies. But it doesn't mean that the integration costs are not there. So that's also something to look at. Of course, hydro is very, very flexible. Gas is very flexible. But a coal-fired power plant or a nuclear power plant are not very flexible and also has integration costs. And that's something to keep in mind as well. A third myth we found in Egypt was that there was a reference before to the next 5 years trying to fill this gap that there is between demand and supply in Egypt. And we found this quote in a newspaper in Egypt that says, Egypt is ready to enter the era of electricity generating using nuclear energy to solve the problem of power in 5 years. I think it's quite clear that especially nuclear energy cannot solve the problem in 5 years. It basically takes too long. And this was one of the points that the CEO of Enel Green Power was making when he looked at renewables, was that it's actually very fast to deploy, and that is certainly correct. So I think that is one of the main benefits of renewables. The fourth and last myth we found on the streets of Egypt is that renewable technologies are still immature. And from a perspective of how much electricity does renewables actually meet, it's 18%, I think it was, according to Paulo Frankel, and he says it's going to go up to 26%. I think the interesting thing is that the share of renewable electricity increases by 0.8% every year. That is quite a lot, and the reason it does so is that actually since 2013, which was the first year, the world installed more renewable power capacity than non-renewable power capacity. And if you look at just one of the technologies, wind energy, you actually installed more wind energy in 2013 than the world installed nuclear power capacity in the last decade. And this is basically the reason why we're seeing that 0.8% percentage point increase in the share of renewables every year. So they are not immature. Some of them may be. Algae power is not a mature technology, but we're seeing more and more mature technology and more cost-efficient technologies. And from our perspective, and I think from a lot of people's perspective, a lot of investors' perspective, Egypt is incredibly interesting. These are just some of the news that we're seeing there, and it is a hotspot for renewable energy investments. And certainly, IRENA will continue to work with the Egyptian government on trying to base their energy policies on facts rather than myths. And we hope that we can continue the very good cooperation we have. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me.